Uh, Thank you for having me. Kansas is uniquely welcoming as a state, as an institution. Everything about the work I do is very counterintuitive. California and Oregon, which you think are very liberal and progressive, are really oppressive when it comes to kids. And Kansas is very open to try to get better outcomes for kids. So I thank you for your hospitality, and I thank you for introducing me to Oklahoma Joe's and Gates. And I think I probably put on 7 pounds since I've been working in Kansas. I'm going to go through a lot of images, and I'm going to go through them really quickly. And it's going to take about an hour, and then I'll answer any questions you want. But little bit of background. This is my modus operandi. I sit on the floor of cells, and this is where I am in pure bliss, just listening to these kids open up. This is unusual because we both have our shoes on. Normally in these institutions, the kids have their shoes off, and what I do is I knock on the side of their cell, and I ask them if I can come in. And then when I come in, I take off my shoes, and I sit on the floor, which is a very rare opportunity for them to have a white person show them respect, an old person give them some sense of dignity, and put them in control of the situation. Rather than talking to them, I listen to them, and they flower. But I'm not a judge, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a probations officer. I'm an artist and a human being. That's it. That's all I got. But that's enough for me. So a little background. I did a lot of work editorially for Scientific America, for photographing on aircraft carriers. The only way I could describe my life was I was a photographic whore. If somebody would call me up and say, would you do something? I would say, yes. How much? And what's it? And what am I going to be doing? And I would call my wife and say, I've got to go to India and shoot a battle zone between the Islamists and the Hindu at the Golden Temple in Ayodhya. And her response would be, who's picking up the kids and when are you going to be back? And it would be Nancy, Thursday. And that was a great supportive relationship. But the LA Times, I had to shoot the Laker girls tryouts for about 3 years in a row. Tough life. And then I started doing things that had a little more edge to them. I shot Guantanamo for Time and for La Repubblica. And part of that was a negotiation of how do you get to these places. And there are a lot of things going on simultaneously, and I'm cooking on multiple burners at once. At the same time, my daughter was interested in making some clothing, said, can you photograph me? Mom made her clothing, but we have no documentation. And I said, sure, how about if I photograph you every morning before you go to high school? And she said, great. And she kept a journal, which no father should ever have to read a journal of their daughter in high school, which I didn't until she was well graduated. She's now 30, great. But it was a diary of bulimia, anorexia, depression, and boys, girls, life in high school. And she published this project as the Leela Sid Project, 722 Days of High School Hell. I did a project called Architecture of Authority that Amy referred to. It was very successful. But I looked at my kids' Montessori school where kids, and this is all to inform my current work, so this is why I'm giving you a quick background. In Montessori, the kids sit on a circle with the teacher, and it's suggested that they are all equals. I'm here at a podium. You've ceded authority to me to speak to you, so you pay attention for an hour. And I look at these situations like the United Nations. I look at the Security Council, where every nation is equal except the Security Council is more equal than other nations. I looked at my kids' high school and the hallways that they had, and I thought, no wonder my kids didn't want to go to high school. It was basically set up like a prison. Tuslong, Cambodia, which was a high school which would process people in Cambodia, 2 million people, before they were executed. So this was the merger of school. It was beyond the cradle to prison pipeline. This was a school that processed people to be executed. Abu Ghraib, one of the hardest negotiations I ever had to do was convince my wife I was sane to go to Iraq in the middle of the worst part of the conflict and photograph it, Abu Ghraib. And these are segregation cells where they kept people that were acting out from the major population. But this was August. I mean, okay, Kansas is 9 degrees today. This was August, and it was 118 degrees. And they kept human beings in these places. And this is basically this room. So I was looking at architecture through this lens of how it cites people in the situation and how they're cited in society because of it. And again, it all brings me back to the kids. Then I come across things like this: the study of art that does not result in making the strong less willing to oppress the weak means little. Booker T. Washington. I've taught at the University of California for 35 years. I'm in the art department. They don't know what to do with me. I respect my colleagues. They talk about line, shape, form, composition. But then I think making art that does not result in a social action, it's a different ballgame. And I found something that really is satisfying for me. It doesn't take away from their ability to make art communicate, but I love what I'm doing. And then I started thinking art is a weapon to change the future. My wife, who's a journalist and now teaches academic writing at the university, said, "Oh, don't use weapon, it's too hard." And I said, we have the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on terrorism. You don't go to war with a tool, you go to war with a weapon. So use art as a weapon to really change something. Don't pussyfoot about it. And I started doing images like this. On the right is Guantanamo. On the left is the El Paso Juvenile Detention Center. And I was able to put things together and have people understand. When I ask the question, what's the difference? It's pretty easy for you to say, oh, the terrorists have a window. The teenagers don't. But it's the same brutalist architecture. If you're treating what you consider the worst of the world and you're putting them in these institutions like Guantanamo, Delta Camp, why are you putting a teenager in there that simply pisses you off? What's the logic? So I can't address everything that needs to be addressed, but some of you that are advocates or working in the field understand that you're looking at foster care, adult sentencing, poverty, gun accessibility, broken families, LGBT, clothing, sanitation, gangs. Any one of these are topics for a dissertation and more, a class and more. So I'm just touching on a little bit of it. The only thing that I can do that I have your attention for, 50 minutes.
I got shot. It was on the 22nd of April. Well, they shattered my thumb, because it went in my thumb and came out by my pinky. And hopefully, they took a piece of bone out of my hip. They put it in my thumb, just like yesterday, but 2 days ago. It's all great. It's all going great. I'm still alive, so I'm good.
So what issues would that address? How stupid teenagers can be? I talked to him about the sense of, are you talking ironically that it's all going great? You just had your right hand shattered. Dude, what are you thinking? And he said, no, it's all going great. So you have a lack of a prefrontal cortex. You have the predominance of violence within a society. You have accessibility of guns. You have, there's so many different topics you can be addressing. So I'm not talking about gun control because I don't want to get into other issues that I would say loaded, but it's a bad pun. But I want to address how we get better outcomes for these kids. And taking them and putting them in an isolation room when they have just had surgery on a thumb that's been shattered and it doesn't work. So there are a million different issues we can discuss, but I'm just one person. But I'm arrogant. I grew up in New York. My dad was a New York City cop, and I think I'm one person. But I literally told my wife, I'm going to start a movement. And she, rolls her eyes. And I said, I'm one person. I have an idea. I have an ability. I have a passion. I can make a picture. I can get articles placed. I know all the editors. I can create a movement. But I'm still one person. So the goal is multifold. Part of my strategy is not only to create this body of work and give it to nonprofits free to be better advocates of their ideas, but also to talk at universities and convince, forgive me for using the phrase, younger people? Sorry, but yes, a new generation to seed the skills to them and the passion that there can be a difference, that it's not just an isolated world that they can live in. And if you figure it out right, you can do it. And I've changed the discussion in this field 1/10 of 1 degree, maybe less, but that's enough. I've done it. So what are you passionate about, and what can you do to change the conversation? I'll give you the tools. I'll tell you how to do it. This is a kid in Oregon who was sentenced to life without parole as a juvenile. So I gave images to people like Brian Stevenson. He presented images as well as in a brief to the Supreme Court. And Miller versus Alabama and Graham versus Florida, they eliminated kids being sentenced to die in prison. They eliminated a conservative Supreme Court said, no, you can't sentence kids to life without parole for capital crimes. And the work was presented in front of Congress, in front of the Senate, in front of the House, all to have different ideas, but to put faces for people to know that there are lives in the balance. So what I'm doing is I give the visual tools to advocates. I want to change the current practice. Yes, I want Kansas to close their juvenile detention centers. It's a radical concept, but it means reallocating the resources to help kids in the community and really being very select about who you lock up and treat them more humanely. And I also want to frame the whole issue for the next generation because I have a limited amount of energy at this point. And I'm going from here to Manhattan, Kansas, going back to Santa Barbara, then to Oklahoma City next week, and then Tulsa, back to home. Then I'm tired. I need other people to help do this. So I'm presenting images, and I want you to remember who these kids are. And in very broad strokes, I want you to realize that many of these institutions are dangerous, ineffective, wasteful, obsolete, and inadequate. I try to put a caption on each specific image, but they run too much together. I can show you an image like this of Sheriff Guzman in Orleans Parish Prison. When you think of the phrase piece of work, Sheriff Guzman is a piece of work. He takes kids, amazingly enough, they're all African American in Louisiana. Unbelievable. 22 of them. There was a fight the night before, so this was in August. He eliminated TV, cards, dominoes, books as punishment. And oh yeah, it's August, it's New Orleans, and the air conditioning wasn't working. But he takes kids from other parishes and he houses them and charges the other parishes, so he's making a profit on the lives of young African American men in New Orleans. 2015, 2014, where do we live? Can we not question ourselves a little bit about what we're doing and who stands up? So I found that I'm the person that's being able to give a voice to those that have the least voice, from families that have the least resources, from communities that have the least power. So I become somewhat messianic about it. It's a real thrill to be able to do it. And I'm not that smart, so I give people the images, and the ones that understand the field better and can use the images to change people's minds, I give them to them and say, go ahead, attack them. This is a 12-year-old who got in a fight at school and then kicked a door in on a cop car. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt, so he really pissed the cops off. POA, that's the big offense for most of these kids, pissing off an adult, forgive me. So he was sentenced basically to 2 weeks to do his homework in a cell. The future is going to look back on this period of mass incarceration in our history with the same disdain that we presently view the shameful past of slavery in America. Your grandchildren may ask why you were oblivious to this and why you didn't protest. This is one of the big shames of our country at this moment. So how do you sit still for it? You can say that it's the prefrontal cortex that's not developed, but adults make the same mistakes and the same poor decisions under the big umbrella of poverty. When poverty overrides everything, adults become virtually adolescent in their decision-making process. There's no accountability. This is Washoe County, Nevada. This is a 5th grader. We've ended up with a policy where we have police in our schools. Back in the old days, way, way back, if I would get in a fight with a kid in 5th grade, the teacher would say to me, you sit here, stop it. I'm not going to hear about it. Now you have police in schools. The police are called instead of the teacher solving it in the classroom. There's a protocol that's brought into place. This is a kid in 5th grade that's brought into the detention center, 10:30 in the morning, Washoe County, Nevada. His mother's working. She can't leave because she'll lose her job if she leaves before she's done and won't be able to provide for the other siblings. So here's a 5th grade kid, no shoes, no belt, because they're afraid that he's on suicide watch, basically. It's damaging to the kid. As soon as he walks through that threshold into a detention center, I guarantee you that the directors of the detention centers who don't control their front door will say, this is no place for a kid. So the director of this detention center took my images, said, can I use them? And she sent them out to all the principals in her district and said, do not send these kids here. Do not initiate a protocol for this kid to be in this place because he doesn't belong here. So that's one of the ways the images are used. But where does this whole mentality come from? In the 80s, newspapers and media, of which whom I worked for decades, they would sell newspapers by saying, super predators, these teenagers are out of control, crazy. And it sold a lot of newspapers. The meth epidemic was basically started by an alternative newspaper, the whole concept of it, in Portland, Oregon. And there was no factual basis to back it up at that time. Yeah, we have meth. Yeah, we have heroin. Yeah, there was a coke generation. But this is the best behaved generation in the history of record keeping. These kids are great. They've never been more law-abiding. Is that going to sell newspapers? Are you going to have most law-abiding generation in modern data collection? No. Are you going to get news broadcasters coming in and telling you, great. So the media has to take responsibility. Using the word juvenile elicits a 4-to-1 negative response. If you describe a kid as youth or kid or child, it's all so much easier. These are kids that we're holding in very brutal conditions. And then you look at what the girls are. And the girls are unique events. And there are so many more mitigating factors involving the girls. And just recently, instead of using the word prostitutes, we started using the phrase sex trafficked victims or sex trafficking, which implies much more that they're passive victims of a condition rather than actively soliciting life on the street. And just phrasing words differently frames the conversation differently. Critically important. The difference between Chicago and LA. Los Angeles, to protect and serve. Chicago, we serve and protect. It's just what comes first. And there are nuances like this that you have to be aware of. On my campus, I saw the police and I looked at what it said. It said, your department, our community. It's just these little things that are really subliminal that inform the way you think about what your role is, what your job is. A girl in Houston, Texas. Everything is really miniature size. The ceilings are about 6.5 feet. It's almost like trailer park furniture. She's so tiny, 11 years old, 10 years old. My wife brought me into a women's room in San Francisco and said, you got to look at this. I said, what? I said, give me a break. What am I looking at here? And she said, here, girls take care of each other. This is something that's lost. We've lost the social contract. How many times have you, I'm 66, okay, maybe I need to take a leak more occasionally than I'd like to admit to, walk into a restroom and they say, bathrooms are for customers only. This is something we decided, that we're not going to take care of each other. So my wife pointed this out to me. She said, I never see something like this, just products that admit we're all girls and we're going to take care of each other. It's a rarity. But other societies don't do this to each other. Hawaii. They invited me to Hawaii, one of the court administrators, and said, we're under federal order. We have to build a new facility. We've built a new facility, and I'm afraid we built the wrong one. And the architecture is going to lock us into practice for the next 50 years. What do we do? Can you show us, document the old and the new? This is the new one they built. It's modeled on Pelican Bay, which is maximum security. This is Pelican Bay, and this is what I shot for Architecture of Authority. This is $165 million spent to house 55 kids that aren't convicted of anything. They're being held. They're pre-adjudicated. $155 million for 55 kids. Run the numbers. Can we do something more effective with this? This is a kid in Alameda County. He aged out, but he's still being held, so they hold one wing for him. Alameda County spends $250,000, $240,000 and change, for each kid in detention. $249,000 for each kid in detention. In Oakland, in the city right within Alameda County, they spend $4,900 a kid for each kid in public school. $4,900, $250,000. I would agree with the most conservative Tea Party person, and I'm reasonably conservative, that we can do better than this. And it's about money, and it's about misspent money. This is a kid that's being held for 19 months now under 24/7 supervision, eyes on. He has a long sentence, so they're afraid he might hurt himself. So the solution is have a corrections officer look at the kid 24 hours a day, and it's been 19 months now. And there's a lot of these people. It's not an individual case. There's several. I've got a library full of adults looking at kids, sitting there looking. It's almost like the jailer becomes the prisoner if that's all you're going to do. And imagine being a teenager and have somebody looking at you for 19 months straight. It's Kafkaesque. Colorado. This is a boot camp that they closed. So they've been closing the boot camps. They figured out that getting kids that are in traumatic backgrounds and shouting at them and then asking for a shout response back of, sir, yes, sir, isn't a good solution. So some of these places have closed. But you have to look at all these kids as existing through a lens of trauma and what they've been through. All the girls have been sexually abused. What percentage of girls have been sexually abused when they come here? What percentage? Everyone. All 88 girls in our custody. And many of the boys. Sexual abuse is rampant. And it's not, we have PREA, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. But before these kids get there, they all describe the uncle, the stepfather that abused them. And it's, I don't know who gave these people license to do it, but these kids are so violated, horrific. And this is all pretty current. I mean, this was shot about 10 days ago. So when a girl has "fuck love" tattooed on her hands, you think she's a real tough cookie. Well, the people that were in charge of loving her, of nurturing her, of protecting her, the people that were supposed to be the love givers, failed her dramatically. So when she puts "fuck love" on her knuckles, it's not really a hostile act, it's a plea. So you have to rephrase the way you look at these kids.
Part of the reason why I started at an early age is because my stepfather, he physically abused me, and when I hit like 4th grade, he started showing me porn with him, and I started getting curious. I tried reporting it to my therapist, and we tried to see if we could put him on charges, but it never happened. My mom lied and told him that she was there the entire time.
So these kids have their own voice, but I don't interject their voice too much. Teenagers mumble. I have an interview strategy of I just sit there on the floor and I just try to slow down the conversation. But this is LA, this is Iowa, this is a young mother who already has a baby that was working at a meat processing plant that was raided by ICE in the largest single event that ICE staged on American territory. They used Black Hawk helicopters and Humvees to go into Postville, Iowa, and they were dealing basically with undocumented workers, many of whom were kids, many of whom ended up in San Diego, Washington State, and then repatriated, but they held a lot of them to testify against the owners of the meatpacking. The experiences that these kids have are dramatic, to say the least. And the laws are so capricious. In California, juveniles spend more time in confinement than adults for the same crimes, 11 months longer. They have no power, so as institutions, we bully them. It makes no sense. This is the Annie Casey Foundation and a lot of the graphs and the data that they present. And they're great in terms of the outcomes that they can predict. You can understand these charts, I'm sure. You're adults. I have no idea what they mean. They're so bizarre to me. And I've been a university professor for 35 years. And then I look at Jerry Brown holding up a visual aid, and I just think, Jerry, come on. So the power of the photograph is really important. And this is what I grew up with Muhammad Ali, with Dorothea Lange, with Nick Ut. And maybe a contemporary generation grows up with the World Trade Center. But these are images that stick. So I try to make images that are going to be literally worth 1,000 words and all the data. So I try to create images like this. And then I work with a website that I've created where I try to have very simple factoids. Here are the countries where children are sentenced to die in prison. That's it. There are 256 countries on the planet. There's one where children are sentenced to die in prison. It's changed a bit. The Supreme Court overturned it. But it's like the governor of Iowa said, I'll commute all the sentences of life imprisonment and I'll make them 60 years. Effectively doing nothing. But then you have statistics like this and charts like this where you can understand, where it says, where it shows you that Americans' reliance on juvenile incarceration is unique in the Western world, all the way over on the right. Keep it simple. Let people understand it. This is a chart where it says youth in confinement, where the number of kids in confinement has gone down. The crime rate has not gone up. In fact, they don't know why it hasn't gone up. The experts that I've spoken to can't figure it out. If they'd understand it, they'd get in front of it and they'd support it. But they can't figure it out. There's a lot of geographic caprice. In Santa Barbara, where I come from, 14 kids are referred to ICE referrals. So they are basically repatriated or deported. Santa Barbara is a really small county, very privileged. LA is the biggest one in the country. They referred to four kids to ICE. So proportionally, it doesn't make any sense. But there's a difference of philosophy amongst the judges. San Francisco, no kid in San Francisco or the Bay Area has been referred to California prisons for smoking weed in about 5 years. 0. They just take a view of, I'm not going to throw away your life for your poor decision. It really has to be something significant for me to take action against you. They may take the kid and say, what are you doing? They may do something to try and engage them on a different level. In Kern County, California, if you're smoking a joint, they throw the book at you. So there's all sorts of local caprice. And I would say to people in Kansas, in Wichita, what's going on in your community? How is law being enforced here? And ask about it. And I'm sure that the people at the detention center will say, yes, this is what we're doing and this is why. And you say, who's making that decision? And you could find out. Annie Casey is a pretty interesting organization where if a judge who is being elected is going to run for re-election, some judges are appointed, some judges are elected, they'll say to the judge, is there an alternative to detention that you can help this kid rather than simply punish him? And the judge says, yes, but I won't be elected. I'll be accused of being soft on crime. Andy Casey will politically go to the DAs or whoever might be running against the judge in the future and say, will you sign off on this alternate course of treatment that may effectively help the kid and help the community? So you can't attack the judge politically. And then the judge is more at liberty to look at things to come to a better outcome for the kid. Amazing. I can't do that stuff, but I can give them images to help make the case. And I make the case by just, all I have to do is say, here, this is a kid. How old does the kid look? Children as young as 7 can be prosecuted and tried in adult court in 22 states and the District of Columbia. I don't want to give a 10,000-word report. I want to give factoids that kids can be sitting at a coffee shop with a friend and say, I was listening to this real wacko guy from California, and he told me this. Can you believe it? And that's the way people remember, and that's the way you get some action. And I'll show images like this. This is J-Wing at LA Central Juvie. And I spend my Sunday afternoons down there. It's about a 2-hour drag from Santa Barbara. But they have 16 cells, and they have kids that are, boys that are 10, 11, and 12. That's a normal sized bed. Look at the size of the kid. So I may end up doing a piece on J-Wing at LA Central. They're pretty fantastic kids. This is a girl who was given meth when she was 7 years old by her mother. She's in Oregon. There was a homicide involved. The girl is doing 35 years. The mother is free. So we've got a system in this country that's basically a Latin term called parens patriae, parent of the nation. It refers to when the state has to intervene for an abusive or negligent parent or legal guardian. It has to act as the parent of any child who's in need of protection. So if you see a kid in a closet, you take the kid out of the closet because the kid is in need of protection. It makes sense. Nobody's going to argue that. But these are isolation rooms, and they're all over the country, that the institutions will put a kid in under the guise of deactivating sensory stimuli. It's an isolation room. Bad place for a kid. Doesn't do any good. Well, we only keep them in there for 20 minutes. I've met kids that were in here for 8 weeks. It happens. Happens way more frequently than you would imagine. This is a kid that's being held. What's lacking from this room? He's been held here for 3 days. No blanket, no mattress, no pillow, no book, no nothing. And it's also 59 degrees in this cell. And there's no light. That window is blocked out. What kid are you going to put in this room and throw those bolts? Is this Silence of the Lamb? Do you have, some Hannibal Lecter in there? I can't imagine having a cell like this for a kid. When the kid sees the door and they put him in this room, what goes through the mind of a teenager? It's horror. And then these are instruments that they use. It's pretty terrible, isn't it? I mean, it's just unbelievable. When a kid is out of control of anybody in the institution, they'll put them in these devices that I can only describe as medieval. This is current, this is Oregon, and this is an institution for girls. What has this girl done to deserve to be in here? What sort of outcome are you going to get? So they hide, and they just try to disappear. And it's horrible for these kids. As horrible as it is for these kids, it's worse for gay kids. And on the right is a transgender kid. So a pre-op girl, boy to girl, male to female, is being held in Hawaii. And she's ostracized by her family, resorts to criminalized behavior. Against federal law, she's being held in isolation. You can't do that. It violates her constitutional rights. But the director says, what do I do? I can't put her in with the girls. I can't put her in the boys. She's going to be killed. What do I do? I don't have the answer. But you have to be somewhat sympathetic. And it gets even worse if they're Native American kids. So this is a kid in Washington State who's Native American, because the jurisdictions are so confused. Depending on what the crime is, depending on where the crime is, who's the perpetrator, who's the victim, it either results in tribal law, state law, or in many cases, federal law. Native American kids are the only ones that are in federal institutions. Down the street, this is Tulsa. It's pretty difficult being gay and Christian in a land of homophobes. Actually, it's pretty impossible here. A 14-year-old from Tulsa. So we've criminalized normal adolescent misbehavior. I've raised 2 kids. I know the antics that they do. It's not criminal, it's just stupid. That's the definition of a teenager. But to put them in these rooms that are described literally as, what color is this? We call it drunk tank pink, and put adolescents in these rooms. Or putting them in rooms like this. This is a kid on suicide watch. He defecated on his tray and then threw it around the room. He said, "This food tastes like shit, I might as well give it back to you." So he's on suicide watch, and then he proceeded to beaver his way through that bottom little grating and escape the next day. What do you expect from these kids? This is a 14-year-old. I spoke to him for an hour and a half. The protocol of the institution was they wouldn't remove his shackles. I'm not a small guy. This is a 14-year-old kid. I'm in a locked room. Where's he going to go? What's he going to do? We can't remove his shackles. That's our protocol. And, of course, most of these kids are kids of color. And this is an example coming up of a girl in Oregon who's going to tell you her story for a minute.
Can't lay down, gotta sit up. I can lay down at 7:30. They wake me up at 6 o'clock. And then if they see us laying down or falling asleep, then they take our mattress and covers. And my back really hurts.
I'm not sure why I have that little icon, little glitch there, but you get the picture. She's in Oregon. There are 50 girls in Oak Creek facility. Now, this is going to be really surprising to you. 49 of them are white. One girl's being held in isolation because she's been intimidating the other girls. Why would an African American girl be intimidating 49 white girls? But she was held for 3 days. She's a mother. She can't lie down. That's their protocol. We are still a racist society. What a surprise. Latino youth are 4 times more likely to receive an adult sentence for the same crime as white children. African American youth are 9 times more likely to receive an adult sentence for the same crime as white children. So these are the kids. $88,000 per year on average. Adult and children, we have 200+ million people incarcerated. And then you have other facts that when you spend $88,000 a year to hold somebody in prison, kids, the cost of meals in Florida prisons are $1.54 a day. How much did that Starbucks cost you this morning? $1.54 a day in terms of the nutritional allotment. That's the cost of it. $88,000 versus about $500 a year. That's $87,500. Where does it go? What are they doing with it? This is the way the kids dress in Missouri, which is a pretty sane state. This is the way they dress them in Idaho. The uniform on the left was banned in 1905 in New York as being too referential to slavery and too demeaning. So they don't allow them in New York State. But a lot of Western states wear uniforms like that. The pat-downs of these kids are constant. And that's, why is it necessary? Are they really going to be creating that many weapons? Yes, they do sometimes, but when you have 8 pat-downs a day, it's really a strategy. We really have to determine who we're afraid of and who simply annoys us, and adjust our graduated responses. These are used in training PowerPoints, images like this, for corrections officers. So I give them to almost anybody that really, what do you need to use them for? Great. In one state, I was told that when these were presented, The corrections officers left the room and said, we're not doing that. When it was suggested that they remove SWAT uniforms and they just get laterally, instead of talking to a kid and talking down to them, you just go, just get on the same level with them, and you can approach them very differently. Does it work? Yeah, Obama knows how to use it. Whenever he's talking to a minority population or kids, always crouches, always, never talks down to them. There are good examples of things going on, like Judge Jimmy Edwards in St. Louis that bought the Blewett School, and they eliminated zero tolerance in St. Louis. They don't throw kids out for any excuse. They try to deal with them in the schools. Santa Barbara just did that last year. Santa Barbara, privileged community. You think California is really progressive. They eliminated zero tolerance, but it was just last year. This is Massachusetts. They didn't have the money to build a facility with an isolation cell. So they went to a CVS and they bought a plastic chair for $7.99. And they took construction paper and they put settling area. And when a kid has a problem with the rest of his peers, they say, hey, go over there and settle down. When you get it together, join the group. Much more effective. Doesn't cost anything. I also do other projects. This is Indiana. This is an image of the Indiana State Fair, Queens. Female, white, Midwestern, Indiana. The outcome of these women, these girls, is dramatically different than this. African American, male, Miami. This wall is put up when kids are released from Miami-Dade detention, and they give them ankle monitors and they say, you go back to your old style. This is where you end up. And it's 50 8.5 by 11 photocopies of kids that are dead, that are killed by gunshot wounds. And it's growing. And this was shot in 2011. It was like 3 years worth. So the difference between the uterus that issued you determines the outcome of your very life. And how people sleep at night in the Miami-Dade system and don't come up with a better solution is beyond me, because this to me is horrifying. So I look at things where, like Talib Kweli, you can't just, if you want to do something about it, you just can't sit there and post it, put it on Tumblr, tweet it. You've got to really get up there and you have to do something about it. And you have to exhaust yourself and you really have to bust a gut and shout and sound like a total idiot, but you have to do something. So I made this website, and I want you to go to that, and I want you to tweet it, and I want you to go to Facebook, and I want you to like it, because that's part of the discussion as well. I engage people at every level. I ended up doing this as a website that people can go to, and it's a very sophisticated search engine that has a lot of data where you can plug in keywords of girls, Kansas, and a bevy of images pop up for you, and it's their stories. And we have a blog that posts their stories at least 2 or 3 times a week with first person, these kids telling you who they are, so that you remember who they are. And there's also the take action part of it, which is critical. I did this work for about 5 years without telling anybody what I was doing. And then Harper's Magazine said, we know your work, we'll give you as much space as you want, and we'll give you anything. You want to write anything you want. And I said, I have more to do. And the publisher said, you've done a decent longitudinal study. You don't have to be the Winnebago with 50 states in the District of Columbia and medallions from everybody. These kids that are already in the institutions deserve attention. So it was published, and then people started to find out what I was doing. It was picked up by Wired, NPR, PBS. It was picked up in Europe by The Guardian. I've been invited to speak to Germany because next month the judges in Germany, to a conference there, they're trying to institute a 3-strike law in Germany. And there are social advocates there that are trying to say, stop Don't do it. It's a disaster. It's been a disaster in California. It's been a disaster in America. I published a book. I did about a dozen books prior to this. No one would publish it. Zero. Books on social justice do not make money, was the mantra that I heard. Hey, Ira, I need a favor. So that's exactly what ended up, and I published it myself. It wasn't quite a vanity press, but I knew I had the audience. I knew that it had to be done, so I invested in it myself. We're in the third printing, so 5,000 copies were sold, and I was able to give away copies to the Supreme Court, to the Black Congressional Caucus, to people that, any governor that wanted it or advocate, I would send them a copy of the book. I'm doing speaking tours constantly to try and get people more engaged. I created an applet so that if you want to go to my website, you can pull an image of the kid, of a dozen kids, pull an image off, and it has one sentence or two about who they are, and you put in your own information, your own phone number, it's fine. I created an exhibition that's not a commodity, that's not matted and framed. I don't care about it. Anybody in this room can pick up an entire exhibition, which is a very radical departure from the normal world of art commodity. Amy called me up, or the preparator here called me up and said, how do we mount this? Do we have magnets or something? I said, doesn't matter. Darts, push pins, doesn't matter. I did a talk in Chicago where there was an exhibition. A kid with a backpack, it was a really crowded room, was leaning against one of the photographs. My older instinct went up to him and said, and then I stopped. I would rather have the kid in the room, and I didn't care about the print. The print can be replaced very easily. There was all sorts of programming that's now around the show. Lawyers are joining the exhibitions and helping kids get their records expunged. As Amy explained, they got a grant from Kansas Welfare or Kansas Health Foundation to get social workers in here some evenings to help direct people to the right services and the right resources. And then I also did something where Human Rights Watch said, well, what is it like being in an isolation room? So I went into intake, and I was there for 24 hours, and I experienced it, and it's not a pleasant experience. And I'm older, and I knew that I could leave when I wanted, if it was an emergency. I knew that they would do whatever I want, but I wore the same clothes that the kids did. I experienced the same isolation, the same cold, the same food. And it was 24 hours, and as well-meaning as this institution was to help me share the experience, it was horrible for me. So 88% of the kids of the images that I showed you in this brief presentation are being held in these institutions for nonviolent crimes. You shouldn't be afraid of them. This is a kid that's been held for was held for 4.5 years without a trial. We have a Sixth Amendment in this country, but these kids have no voice. I went to visit him, I think last month, in Okeechobee, Florida, which is the top. The bottom is LA Central, to give you an idea of what these institutions like. Okeechobee is the gateway to the South, the speckled perch capital of the world. I think you'll find our community prides itself most on the hospitality of its residents. The incarcerated population of Okeechobee is 2,700 people. The residents of Okeechobee are 5,500 people. It's a prison city. So that's where they're now holding this kid, Ronald Franklin. Idaho, this is maximum security Idaho. They don't have concertina wire, and they don't have barbed wire. And this is maximum security for kids. They say to the kids, this is your shot. You could run away, we'll get you. But if you give it a shot, we'll help you. We'll change your life. And they mix older kids with younger kids, and the older kids say, they're serious here. They're not screwing with you. They want to help you. Nobody runs away. How do you do that? It's just rethinking what's been done and doing it differently. Instead of holding the child accountable to society and its institutions, it's rethinking it and having society and its institutions accountable to the child. It can be done. So this is what I'm doing. I'm doing The two books on the right are going to be released in October. A book on girls in the justice system, and Juvie Talk, Unlocking the Language of Lockdown. And part of that is when kids talk about being washed or propped up or wearing patakis, it describes what their life is. And I'm also working with a guy named Peter Sellers, who's a well-known theatrical director, to help create a play that kids can put on in middle schools and high schools so they can identify a little bit more with the kids. And I'm working with Casey Family Services to start getting images of kids that are in child protective custody, even a more fragile world. But I can't do it alone. So I'm trying to do something now called the Image of Justice, where I get people in different communities to give them the skills of how to put this together and do their own research in terms of getting access to facilities and then putting it on a website that I hope Getty Images will host. So this one is in the works. I'm going to talk to the Ford Foundation in New York next month to try and put down, not the normal $20,000 grant for artists, but something major to really make it sustainable. So this is a kid in LA Central, and this is about 2 weeks ago. He is about this tall, and he keeps on stealing cars. Anthony, why do you steal cars? I live in Watts, man. Well, why do you steal cars? Well, I want to get away. Where do you go? I don't know, I can't read. When do you stop? When I run out of gas or when they pull me over? Why do you go? I live in Watts. I just want to be anywhere but there. So he's so existential in his philosophy and so succinct, and he's so little. But this is who these kids are. So one person, you can do a lot. People within the institutions, you can change them. When I talk to judges, I suggest they spend a day or go and visit the institutions that they put these kids in. One person in Biloxi, Mississippi, the judge had been on the bench for 32 years. He had never seen the institution that he put these kids in, ever. But there are things we can do. There are ways we can do it. It's not a hopeless world. It's a depressing one at the moment, but it's not hopeless. And you can, should, I hope, be a part of it. Sign up for this. Tweet that shit. Do all the stuff you're supposed to do. And thank you, Kansas, heartfelt, for being very open, for having me, for exhibiting this work, and having me visit the institutions with really open doors. It's been remarkable, the access that Kansas has allowed, so I thank you for it.